Picture this. You're on public transport, privy to a stranger telling a young boy that he's an interloper. Do you intervene or remain a silent observer like the rest? The bus reeked of stale moisture and budget aftershave, an odor that lingered offensively. 17-year-old Marcus Bell scarcely registered it. His thoughts were still captive to the final moments of history class, replaying the teacher's instructions regarding an imminent group assignment. He loathed collaborative projects. The outcome was always predictable. He shouldering the workload while his peers shirked their responsibilities. As he hoisted his satchel and located his habitual spot midway down the aisle, he barely acknowledged the lady a few rows ahead. Beatrice Ainsworth. The name was emblazoned on her designer handbag, sat rigidly, clutching the handrails as if anticipating a sudden plunge. She was the sort of individual Marcus had instinctively learned to disregard. Mature, uptight, exuding an air of entitlement. The bus lumbered into motion, merging with the stream of traffic. A cohort of teens from a rival school guffawed boisterously near the rear, their voices echoing against the graffiti-scarred windows. A construction worker perched near the driver, tapping his foot to an unheard rhythm. Marcus retrieved his phone, hoping music would provide a sonic barrier. But before he could insert his earbuds, a shrill voice ruptured the ambient noise. "I don't know what this city's becoming." The remark wasn't directed at anyone specifically, but its volume ensured that Marcus couldn't ignore it. Beatrice was shaking her head, her lips drawn into a tight line. Her eyes flicked toward him momentarily before darting away. Marcus had encountered that look previously, in instructors who harbored low expectations of him, in shop attendants who scrutinized him excessively, in neighbors who feigned blindness when he passed. He returned to his phone. Not today. He refused to allow some embittered woman to sour his journey home. But the problem with individuals like her was their refusal to cease after a single utterance. The bus progressed, but the atmosphere inside had undergone a transformation, as if poised on the brink of collapse. The bus jolted forward at a stoplight, sending a tremor through the occupants. Marcus gripped the seat handle to maintain his balance. He had almost managed to persuade himself to disregard her, to let her words wash over him as he typically did. But Beatrice wasn't finished. "This used to be such a pleasant place," she muttered, her voice amplified. Several people glanced in her direction, then hastily averted their gaze. No one desired involvement. Marcus remained taciturn, hoping she would desist. She didn't. Kids these days have no respect, invading, taking over, acting like they own everything. Makes you wonder where they even came from. That was the tipping point. Marcus's fingers tightened around his phone, his pulse accelerating. His mother's admonition echoed in his mind. "Choose your battles wisely, Marcus. Not every altercation is worthwhile." Perhaps this fell into that category. Perhaps he should simply allow her to rant and keep his head down. But then she turned towards him, her eyes narrowing, as if she had finally identified her target. "You don't belong here. Go back to Africa." The bus fell into complete silence. Marcus felt the collective gaze pivot in his direction. Some appeared uneasy, fidgeting in their seats, feigning absorption in their devices. Others simply observed, awaiting his response. The construction worker ceased his foot tapping. Even the rowdy teens in the back had quieted momentarily. Marcus remained motionless, staring at the woman who had hurled those words at him as if they were undeniable truths, as if she possessed the prerogative to dictate his belonging. A part of him yearned to chuckle, to scoff at the ridiculousness of her pronouncements, at the insignificance of her words. But another part of him smoldered, not with fury, but with something more profound, the weariness that sets in after witnessing too much of this, experiencing too much of it. And still, individuals like her behaved as if they were articulating some novel concept. The silence stretched, dense and oppressive, as everyone anticipated the ensuing events. Marcus could feel the weight of every stare pressing upon him. His hands clenched his phone, but he compelled himself to breathe deeply and steadily. Beatrice's expression remained unchanged. She sat, shoulders squared, awaiting his outburst, eager to validate her prejudices. He refused to grant her that satisfaction, but he also refused to allow her remark to go unchallenged. A man near the front cleared his throat. Not a vocalization, but a noise, the kind people produce when they wish to express something without becoming entangled. A teenage girl near the back glanced at her friend, her eyes widening. A woman in a tailored suit shifted uncomfortably, clutching the strap of her purse. And yet, no one spoke. Marcus finally broke the silence. "What did you just say?" His voice was even almost too controlled. Beatrice scoffed, crossing her arms. "You heard me." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Yes, I did. I just want to ensure that you heard yourself." Her mouth tightened into a thin line. "I don't need to explain anything to you. Are you certain? Because at this moment, I suspect everyone present would be interested in learning why you believe you possess the authority to dictate my belonging." Several heads swiveled back towards Beatrice. Someone near the front emitted a muted chuckle, quick, almost apologetic. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, just momentarily, then vanished as rapidly as it had appeared. "People like you," she began, but Marcus interjected. "People like me? What?" He allowed the words to hang in the air, daring her to complete the sentence. Beatrice hesitated, and in that brief pause, Marcus recognized it. She wasn't anticipating resistance. She wasn't expecting someone like him, a teenager, a mere child in her estimation, to confront her head-on. But now, the entire bus was watching, waiting, and her self-assurance had diminished. Marcus sensed the shift occurring, and he knew this was no longer solely about him. Marcus inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He could feel the tension, thick and palpable, pressing in from all sides. Every individual on that bus was waiting, their eyes oscillating between him and Beatrice, uncertain of what would transpire. "You know what's amusing?" Marcus remarked, his voice composed yet resolute. "You're sitting here ordering me to go back to Africa as if this country doesn't belong to people like me. But tell me something. Where do you think you came from?" Beatrice's lips pursed, but she remained silent. "You think your ancestors just sprouted from the soil right here in America? Because they didn't, just as mine didn't." Murmurs rippled through the bus. Someone near the front nodded almost imperceptibly, just enough for Marcus to register it. "The difference between you and me," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "is that my ancestors were brought here in chains. They weren't given a choice, but they built this country. Every brick, every road, every law that you take for granted, black hands helped make that happen." Beatrice released a scornful laugh. "Oh, give me a break." "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You don't get to dismiss it. You don't get to act like history didn't happen just because it makes you uncomfortable." The bus was so hushed now that Marcus could discern the faint hum of the engine beneath them. "The problem isn't that I don't belong here," he said, his voice softer but unwavering. "The problem is that you don't know how to share a space that was never exclusively yours to begin with." Beatrice's face contorted into an expression Marcus couldn't decipher. Anger? Embarrassment? He couldn't be certain. But what he did know was that she had run out of ammunition. The silence was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone on that bus who had remained silent for too long. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing against every surface. Beatrice's lips parted as if she desired to respond, to reclaim some of the authority she had just forfeited. But nothing emerged. She had spent her life uttering pronouncements like this, assuming they would go unchallenged. But now, confronted with something she couldn't simply dismiss, she was bereft. Marcus remained still. He didn't smirk, he didn't gloat. He merely sat there, looking at her, waiting. And then someone spoke. "He's right." The voice emanated from the front, the construction worker. His words weren't loud, but they were firm. Another voice, this time from the rear. "You all ever notice how it's always the loudest ones who know the least?" A woman near the center of the bus shook her head, weary of witnessing this spectacle repeatedly. Beatrice's shoulders tensed. She glanced around, realizing that the dynamic had shifted. It was no longer simply her and Marcus. Now, the entire bus was involved. For the first time since she had spoken, Beatrice appeared uncertain. She emitted a scoff, shaking her head as if dismissing the entire event, but her voice was quieter when she muttered, "Unbelievable." Marcus could sense the energy changing again, this time lighter. The tension that had been thick enough to cleave through had dissipated. He turned back towards the window, staring out at the familiar streets rolling by. The bus felt different now, not because something monumental had occurred, but because something small had. Beatrice sat stiffly in her seat, staring ahead, her mouth set in a rigid line. Perhaps she would disembark from this bus and continue exactly as she always had. Perhaps she wouldn't. But everyone else, they had witnessed something, they had heard something, and perhaps the next time they found themselves in a similar situation, they wouldn't remain silent. Marcus exhaled, feeling a slight lifting of the weight as the bus continued its journey. The bus trundled on, the city outside flitting past in glimpses. Street signs, traffic lights, storefronts with vibrant signs. Marcus sat back in his seat, letting his head rest against the window. His pulse had decelerated, but he could still feel the residual heat of the moment pressing against his skin. No one else spoke, not to Beatrice, not to him, but something had undeniably shifted. He could sense it. A few stops later, the construction worker rose, gripping the rail as the bus slowed. Before disembarking, he glanced back at Marcus and offered a subtle nod. One of those quick, tacit acknowledgments that conveyed more than words ever could. As the doors hissed open and shut behind him, Marcus noticed the teenage girl near the rear whispering to her friend. Her eyes flickered towards Beatrice before she muttered, "I hope I never end up like that." Beatrice didn't react, but her face had lost some of its conviction. Marcus turned away, ceasing to monitor her. He had articulated what he needed to say. Whether or not she gleaned something from it wasn't his responsibility. As the bus approached his stop, he grabbed his backpack and rose. He could feel eyes upon him, some approving, some contemplative, some simply unsure of what they had just witnessed. The doors groaned open, and as he stepped down onto the pavement, a woman's voice called out behind him. "Hey!" He turned back. It was the woman in the tailored suit. She regarded him for a moment, then offered a tight smile. "You handled that well." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, not out of hubris, not out of triumph, but because in that moment he understood something. Today wasn't merely about silencing one individual. It was about prompting others to contemplate. The bus pulled away, its engine fading into the background. Marcus exhaled, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. As he proceeded down the sidewalk, he knew that the world would still be what it was. There would be more Beatrices, more situations like this. But today, on that bus, something had fractured open. And sometimes, that's how change commences. Because silence perpetuates the status quo. But speaking initiates a transformation. If you've made it this far, ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have spoken out? Or would you have remained silent, hoping someone else would intervene? Let's discuss it in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, share it, because discussions like these need to occur.